Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to talk about a very important topic in anatomy and physiology, the various types of nephrons. Okay, so if you're a nursing student, you're a medical student, or anyone studying the urinary system, okay, this is a topic you definitely need to understand because you see, the nephrons are the functional units of the kidney. Okay, now basically there are two major types of nephrons. For the two major types of nephrons, we have what we call the cortical nephrons, and then we have the juxtamedullary nephrons. So in this video, the focus is just going to be on the various types of nephrons. Okay, so the cortical nephrons and then the juxtamedullary nephrons. So by the end of this video, you should be able to explain what a nephron is. Okay, you should be able to identify the two types of nephrons. Again, you should be able to describe their structural differences and also explain their functions. Okay, and more importantly, you should understand why juxtamedullary nephrons are so important when it comes to the concentration of urine. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, let's talk about a nephron. What is a nephron? Okay, yes, what is a nephron? Now, basically, a nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidney. Okay, is the structural and functional unit of the kidney. What does that mean? In simple terms, okay, the nephron is the tiny structure inside the kidney that performs the major processes involved in the urine formation. You know, the primary function of the kidney, or the main function of the kidney, is urine formation. Okay, and when we talk of urine formation, then we are trying to talk about a process by which your body is getting, through the kidney, your body is getting rid of waste products or waste substances. Is that okay? Great. And that is how urine formation comes in. So the tiniest structure in your kidney, okay, that is responsible for performing that function of urine formation, sort of letting your body get rid of waste substances, is the nephron. Okay, and if we look at each of the kidneys, each kidney contains approximately 1 million nephrons. Okay, each kidney contains approximately 1 million nephrons. So what that means is that if you take an adult or an average adult with two kidneys, we are expecting 2 million nephrons in the average adult. Okay, if you take an adult that have donated one kidney, okay, then we are expecting 1 million nephron in such an individual. Okay, but the average adults that have two kidneys, we are expecting approximately 2 million nephrons, because each kidney contains approximately 1 million nephrons. Like I said earlier, okay, the nephron is responsible for forming urine, okay, sort of getting rid of, helping your body to get rid of waste substances, okay. And so the nephron is responsible for, one, filtering the blood. Okay, so one of the major functions of the nephron is to filter your blood, filtering the blood. Okay, it's also responsible for reabsorbing useful substances. The nephron is also responsible for secreting unwanted substances. Okay, and then eventually forms urine, or forming the urine. The nephron also helps maintain fluid and electrolyte balances. It also helps regulate the body's acid-base balance. Okay, so these are the functions of the nephrons. Okay, so the nephron is responsible for filtering your blood, reabsorbing useful substances. Okay, so in the process of urine formation, if it gets to a time where, you know, there are substances in the nephron tubules that your body needs or that is deficient in your body, the nephrons have that ability to reabsorb them back into your body. And then within that same process, if you get to a point where there are certain substances that are in excess in your blood, your nephrons can secrete some of them within the peritubular capillaries back into the tubules. Is that okay? Yes. And that is what we call secretion. Okay, so secreting unwanted substances in your blood back into the tubules to form part of your urine so that you excrete them away. Okay, and eventually, so after filtering the blood, reabsorbing useful substances, secreting unwanted substances, then eventually we have the urine. Is that okay? Your nephrons also have the ability, to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance. They also help to regulate acid-base balance. In fact, they also help regulate your water balance. Okay, so these are the primary functions of the nephron. Okay, so when we talk about the kidney function, we are essentially talking about what the nephrons are doing. Okay, so if we ask you what are the functions of the kidney, we are just talking about what's the functions of the nephrons. Is that so? Whatever function the kidney performs, is the engine behind that function is the nephron. And that's why we say the nephrons are referred to as the structural and functional unit of the kidney. Is that okay? That is the nephrons. Okay, so now let's look at the various parts of a nephron. Okay, the various parts of a nephron. So before we discuss the two types of nephrons, namely the cortical nephrons and then the juxtamedullary nephrons, let's look at the various parts of a nephron. Now, a nephron has two major parts or two major components. Okay, there are two major components. We have the glomerulus, and then we have the Bowman's capsule, also called the glomerular capsule. Okay, so if you say the glomerulus and then the glomerular capsule together, that is what we refer to as the renal corpuscle. So a typical nephron has two major parts. The first part is what we call the renal corpuscle, and then the second part is what we call the renal tubule. Okay, so every nephron has two major parts. Understand that. So the first part of a nephron, we call it the renal corpuscle. And when we say renal corpuscle, the Bowman's capsule, this is what we call the Bowman's capsule. So the Bowman's capsule plus the glomerulus. This Bowman's capsule plus the glomerulus together, that is what we call the renal corpuscle. Okay, so the nephron has two parts, the renal corpuscle, which is the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule, plus the renal tubules. And the renal tubule is made up of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, as well as the collecting duct. That's the tubules. Okay, so a typical nephron is made up of two major parts. The two major parts, we have the renal corpuscle. What is a renal corpuscle? A renal corpuscle refers to the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule combined. Okay, then we have the renal tubules. What is a renal tubules? The renal tubule consists of, we have the proximal convoluted tubule, we have the loop of Henle, where we have the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then we have the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Then from there we have the distal convoluted tubule. Then we have the collecting duct. All these together is what we refer to as the renal tubule. So every nephron has two major parts. The first part is called the renal corpuscle. What is a renal corpuscle? The renal corpuscle is made up of the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule. Okay, the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule is what we refer to as the renal corpuscle. Then the part B, we call it the renal tubule. What is a renal tubule? The renal tubule of a nephron consists of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, which consists of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule. Then lastly, we have the collecting duct. Okay, so the proximal convoluted tubule, the lobe of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule plus the collecting duct together forms the renal tubule. And we can ask you in exams that what forms the renal tubule? The renal tubule consists of the proximal convoluted tubule, the lobe of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, okay, and the collecting duct. That's the renal tubule. So now you understand the various parts of a nephron. So a nephron has two major parts, the renal corpuscle, and then we have the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule. And then we have the renal tubule. The renal tubule consists of the proximal convoluted tubule, the lobe of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. Simple as that. Is that okay? Yeah, so basically that is it for the nephron. Okay, that is what forms the various parts of a nephron. So as the filtrate moves through the structures, the parts that we've spoken about, substances are reabsorbed, substances are secreted, and eventually urine is being produced. Okay, so now that we understand the basic nephron, let us look at the two types of nephrons. So like I said earlier, there are two types of nephrons. We have the cortical nephrons. The first one, we call it the cortical nephrons. And the second one, we call it the juxta medullary nephrons. The cortical nephrons and the juxta medullary nephrons. Now, the major difference between them is where the renal corpuscles are located and how far their loop of Henle extend into the medulla. Okay, so that's the major difference. So if you really want to understand the various types of nephrons, we use the position of the renal corpuscle. And you know the renal corpuscle already. The renal corpuscle or the nephron corpuscle refers to the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule combined. Okay, the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule. That is what forms the renal corpuscle. So if you want to know the difference between a cortical nephron and a juxta medullary nephron, we basically use where the renal corpuscle are located and how far their loops of Henle extend into the medulla. So first of all, let's look at cortical nephrons. Okay, so cortical nephrons are the most common types of nephrons. Okay, so one thing that you have to note is that the most common types of nephrons in the kidney is the cortical nephrons. Okay, great. They are the cortical nephrons. Okay, in fact, cortical nephrons make up approximately 85% of all nephrons in the kidney. Okay, they make up approximately 85%. And that is why we say that cortical nephrons are the most common types of nephrons we have in the kidney. Okay, so we have a lot of cortical nephrons within the kidney. Why? Because they make up approximately 85% of all nephrons in the kidney. Now, let's look at the anatomical characteristics. Okay, now, for cortical nephrons, their renal corpuscles are located mainly in the outer part of the renal cortex. Okay, good. So that is one thing about the cortical nephrons. Okay, so they are situated mainly in the renal cortex and their glomeruli are located deeper in the renal cortex. So let's look at the diagram. Okay, so this is a typical example of a cortical nephron. So this is a cortical nephron. Okay, so in this diagram, from this portion to this upper part, okay, is showing the cortex of the kidney or the cortical area in the kidney. And you can see clearly that this is the renal corpuscle of a cortical nephron. This is the renal corpuscle. Okay, this is the renal corpuscle. Okay, so from this diagram, you can see clearly that the cortical nephrons, their glomerulus or their renal corpuscle is deep within the renal cortex. It's located deep within the renal cortex. Is that okay? So you can see clearly their renal corpuscle, or what we call their glomerulus or their Bowman's capsule, is deep within the renal cortex. That is one character of the cortical nephrons. Is that okay? And that's why we call them cortical nephrons. Why? Their renal corpuscle or their glomerulus, they are situated deep in the outer part of the renal cortex. Is that okay? They are deep within the renal cortex. Okay, so if we ask you what are the characteristics of a cortical nephron, for cortical nephrons, their glomerulus are located deep within the renal cortex, and that's why we call them cortical nephrons. And they are the most common types of nephrons we have in the kidney. Why? They constitute 85% of all nephrons in the kidney. Okay, yeah, so that is one character of cortical nephrons. Again, if we look at the loop of Henle of cortical nephrons, they have short loops that barely dip into the medulla. Okay, so let's look at the loop of Henle. From here, coming up here is what we call the loop of Henle. Okay, and I told you in this diagram, you see from this area, this region down to this point is what we call the medulla of the kidney. You can see clearly that, look, you see because the cortical nephrons, their loop of Henle is very short, they barely extend to reach the medullary region of the kidney. So you could see that a greater portion of the nephron is within the cortex. So one thing you can say is that for cortical nephrons, a greater portion of the nephron, the tubules, are within the cortex. Okay, so you can see that a greater portion. So because you see just this tiny part of the tubule is getting to, so it's barely reaching the medulla. So you can say clearly that a greater portion of the tubules, specifically the loop of Henle, is within the renal cortex. Okay, great. So that is it for cortical. So first of all, cortical nephrons, their renal corpuscles, okay, are located deep within the cortex. In fact, their renal corpuscles are deep within the cortex. Okay, now if you come to their renal tubules, the renal tubules barely dip into the medulla. Okay, but you see the part that is extending into the medulla is the loop of Henle. So in anatomy, we say that for cortical nephrons, okay, they have short loops of Henle that barely reaches the medulla, or that barely dip into the medulla. Okay, that is cortical nephrons. Is that okay? Great. Yes. And again, another difference is with their functions. Cortical nephrons are primarily responsible for excreting and regulating of electrolytes. Okay. Yes. So practically, when we say cortical nephrons, their renal corpuscles are within the cortex and they have short loop of Henle. Okay, so you can say cortical nephrons, one, the anatomical characteristics, their renal corpuscle are located deep within the cortex, or you can say their glomerulus is located deep within the cortex, or you can say their Bowman's capsule is located deep within the cortex. Two, their loop of Henle, very short loop of Henle. And again, their loop of Henle barely reaches the medulla. They barely dip into the medulla, or they barely reach the medulla. Is that okay? That is a cortical nephron. So when we say a cortical nephron, one, their renal corpuscles are located deep within the cortex, okay, within the outer cortex. Two, their loop of Henle, very short loop of Henle. They have very short loop of Henle. And three, their loop of Henle barely reaches the medulla, or the medullary region of the kidney. That is a cortical nephron. Now let's talk about the second one. And like I mentioned earlier, if you look at the functions, cortical nephrons are primarily responsible for excretion and regulation of electrolytes. Is that okay? Great. They are primarily responsible for excretion and then regulation of electrolytes. Okay. So now, if you want to look at the functions more extensively, these types of nephrons are very important because they play a role in filtration, reabsorption, secretion, regulation of electrolytes, maintaining fluid balance, and formation of urine. Okay. However, if you want to compare cortical nephrons to juxta medullary nephrons, cortical nephrons basically have a less important role when it comes to producing highly concentrated urine. Why is it so? You see, their loops of Henle are very short. Okay, the short loop of Henle, they are not as effective in creating the deep medullary osmotic gradients required for maximum urine concentration. Okay, as compared to the juxta medullary nephrons. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about the juxta medullary nephrons. Let's talk about the juxta medullary nephrons. Okay, good. So let's go back to the diagram. Let's go back to our diagram. All right. So this is an example. This is a diagram representing the juxta medullary nephron. Okay. So now, if we want to compare this juxta medullary nephron to the cortical nephron, you can see clearly that you can see that for the juxta medullary nephrons, even though the renal corpuscle are within the cortex, or their glomerulus is within the cortex, but they are not deep within the outer cortex. You can see clearly the renal corpuscle is located at the junction, okay, it's located at the junction of the medullary region of the kidney. Okay, this is the medulla, okay, and then this is the cortex. From here to here is the cortex. So you can see their renal corpuscle is at the border of the medullary region of the kidney, or is at the border of the cortical region of the kidney. Unlike the cortical nephrons, where the renal corpuscles are within the outer part, they are deep within the outer part of the cortex. But for juxta medullary nephrons, you can see clearly that the renal corpuscles are closer, or is at the border, okay, of the cortical region or the medullary region of the kidney. And that's why we call it juxta medullary nephrons. Is that okay? That's why we call it the juxta medullary. So the word juxta means near. When we say juxta, it simply means near or closer. Okay. While medullary refers to the medullary region of the kidney. And that's why we call it juxta medullary nephron. So when we say juxta medullary nephron, it means the renal corpuscle is closer to the medulla, or the glomerulus is closer to the medulla. Okay, so the juxta medullary nephrons, their glomerulus are closer to the medullary region of the kidney. Unlike the cortical nephrons, where their glomerulus are situated deep in the outer cortex, juxta medullary nephrons, their renal corpuscle or their glomerulus are closer to the medulla. Okay, and you see they have very long loop of Henle. You can see clearly that their loop of Henle, unlike the cortical nephrons, their loop of Henle is very long loop of Henle. Okay, and again, these nephrons constitute 15% of all nephrons in the kidney. Is that okay? Now, one key feature of juxta medullary nephron is that, okay, they have very long loop of Henle. Okay, and you can see clearly from the diagram that their loop of Henle, okay, their loop of Henle extend deep into the medulla or the medullary region. Okay, unlike the cortical nephrons, you see the cortical nephrons, their loop of Henle barely dip into the medulla. This area from here down here is the medullary region, and you could see clearly that you see cortical nephrons, their loop of Henle are very short, in a way that is barely reaching the medullary region of the kidney. But for juxta medullary nephrons, their loop of Henle, very long loop of Henle that extends into the medullary region of the kidney. That is one. So the characteristics of juxta medullary nephrons: one, their renal corpuscles are closer to the medullary region of the kidney. Two, their glomerulus is closer to the medullary region of the kidney. Three, their Bowman's capsules are closer to the medullary region of the kidney. Four, they have very long loop of Henle that extend deep into the medullary region of the kidney. Okay, and then again, they constitute 15% of all nephrons in the body. Now, remember, juxta medullary nephrons, their renal corpuscles are closer to, we call it, the anatomical word we use is, we call it the cortico-medullary junction. Okay, so here, you see, this is where we call, this region is the cortex, and this region is the medulla, and here is the junction. Here is the junction. You could see clearly that the renal corpuscle is closer to the cortico-medullary junction. So for juxta medullary nephrons, the renal corpuscle is closer to the cortico-medullary junction of the nephrons. Okay, you can also say the glomerulus are closer to the cortico-medullary junction of the nephrons. You can say that the Bowman's capsules are closer to the cortico-medullary junction of the nephrons. Is that okay? Yes, and that is what we refer to as juxta medullary nephrons. Okay, now in terms of their functions, okay, for their functions, juxta medullary nephrons are essential for urine concentration and water balance regulation. Juxta medullary nephrons are essentially responsible for urine concentration and water balance regulation. Okay, yes, so basically that is it for the two types of nephrons in the kidney. So the human kidney contains two main types of nephrons. Okay, so the two main types of nephrons, we have the cortical nephrons, and then we have the juxta medullary nephrons. And we mentioned that for cortical nephrons, they are the commonest types of nephrons we have in the kidney. Why? They constitute approximately 85% of all nephrons in the kidney, whereas the juxta medullary nephrons constitutes 15% of all nephrons we have in the kidney. And that tells you that we have more of cortical nephrons in the kidneys as compared to juxta medullary nephrons. Okay, now for the anatomical characteristics, we mentioned that if you want to differentiate between a cortical nephron and a juxta medullary nephron, we usually use the location of the renal corpuscles. And we mentioned that for cortical nephrons, the renal corpuscles are situated deep in the outer cortex. Okay, they are located deep in the outer cortex. That is why we call them the cortical nephrons. And another anatomical feature of cortical nephrons is that their loop of Henle are very short. They have very short loop of Henle that barely dips into the medulla. They have very short loop of Henle that barely dips into the medulla. Okay, so you can see clearly that their loop of Henle is very short, and their loop of Henle barely reaches the medullary region of the kidney. Okay, and you can also see that for cortical nephron, a greater portion of their tubules is within the cortex. Okay, so a greater portion of the tubules, the renal tubules of a cortical nephron, is within the renal cortex. That's why we call it cortical nephrons. Okay, so you can see that a greater portion of the tubule is within the cortex. Is that okay? Great. Then we come to the juxta medullary nephrons. Okay, so for juxta medullary nephrons, you can see that their renal corpuscles are located closer to the cortico-medullary junction of the kidney. Okay, what is the cortico-medullary junction? That's the junction where we have the cortex, or more like the border of the cortex and the medulla. And you can see clearly that, you see, there's the renal corpuscle of the juxta glomerular nephron. Sorry, juxta medullary nephron. Okay, there's a renal corpuscle. Okay, so you can say that. You can say it in two ways. You can say for juxta medullary nephrons, okay, the glomerulus are located closer to the cortico-medullary junction of the nephron. Or you can say the glomeruli are closer to the medullary region of the kidney. Unlike the cortical nephrons, where the glomerulus is situated deep in the outer part of the cortex. This one is not deep in the outer part of the cortex. This one is quite closer to the cortical medullary junction, the arenal corpuscles. Okay, and you can see from this diagram that you see the tubules or the loop of Henle of the juxtamedullary nephron is very long as compared to the cortical nephrons. Is that okay? They have very long loop of Henle, and that's why that is why they are very essential when it comes to urine concentration and water balance. They are very, very essential, okay, when it comes to urine concentration and water balance. Okay, then we can also say that a greater portion, okay, of the arenal tubules are within the medullary region of the kidney for juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, so, and you can see that a greater portion of the loop of Henle is within the medullary region of the kidney. Okay, or you can say that the loop of Henle or the nephron loop